The street was quiet that night. Most shops had closed, and the warm glow of streetlights painted soft patterns on the road. The lawyer drove home slowly, his mind still filled with the arguments he had made earlier in court. It had been a long day, but a good one. He had just helped a client avoid an unfair conviction, and that always gave him a sense of peace. He turned up the volume of his old jazz playlist and relaxed his shoulders. For him, driving at night was a kind of therapy, a few minutes where he could breathe, think, and let go of the courtroom's weight. But that night something unexpected happened. In his rearview mirror, flashing lights appeared. A police car was tailing him, siren off but lights spinning. He felt a small knot in his stomach. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't breaking any rule. Still, he pulled over to the side as any responsible person would. He rolled down his window, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and waited calmly. The two officers stepped out. He noticed their faces through the mirror. Hard expressions, sharp eyes. One of them tapped on his window. "License and registration," the officer said flatly. The lawyer handed them over without a word. "Can you tell me what this stop is about?" he asked politely. The officer didn't answer. He looked at the documents, then back at the lawyer, then at the car interior. His tone grew tense. "You live around here?" "Yes," the lawyer replied. "A few blocks away." "I just finished work." "What kind of work?" the officer asked. "I'm an attorney," he said, keeping his voice even. For a brief second, silence filled the air. The officer's expression shifted slightly, though it was hard to tell what he was thinking. Then the second officer came closer, shining a flashlight into the car. "We got a report about a stolen vehicle matching this description," the second officer said. "That's impossible," the lawyer answered calmly. "This car is registered under my name." "You can check the plates." "Step out of the car," the first officer ordered. He hesitated. "Officer, I can show you proof right here." "Step out now," the voice snapped. He did as told, opening the door slowly and raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't resisting. The night air felt cooler now, but his heart was beating faster. He'd handled many police misconduct cases before, but it felt different standing on the roadside, under flashing lights, with no control over what might happen next. They told him to stand at the back of the car while one officer called for verification. The lawyer tried to keep calm. "You can check my briefcase," he said softly. "My ID bar card is right there," but they didn't look. Instead, they exchanged glances. The second officer suddenly said, "Keep your hands where I can see them." He froze. "They're right here," he said, his voice steady but tired. The officer moved closer. "Don't talk back. I'm not," the lawyer replied. "I'm just trying to cooperate." And then something happened that changed everything. The first officer grabbed his arm roughly, twisting it behind his back. "You're resisting," the officer said. "I'm not resisting." He protested, his voice rising. "I'm complying." But the words didn't matter. They forced him against the car, his cheek pressed against cold metal. Pain shot through his shoulder. He tried to turn his head to breathe, but a heavy hand pushed him down again. In the background, he heard one of them speaking into a radio, reporting a non-compliant suspect. He didn't fight back. He couldn't. Years of knowing the system told him that any sudden move could be misread, twisted, or worse. He stayed still, focusing on his breathing. When it was over, they left him sitting on the curb, handcuffed, his suit torn at the sleeve. Neighbors had gathered by now, watching silently. Some filmed with their phones. No one spoke. After about 10 minutes, another patrol car arrived. A supervisor stepped out, older and calmer than the first two. He asked what was happening. The officers gave their version, painting the lawyer as uncooperative. The supervisor looked at him and said, "What's your name?" The lawyer spoke quietly. "I'm an attorney. My ID is in the briefcase." They didn't check. The supervisor went to verify, and after a few tense minutes, he returned. His face had changed. He knew there had been a mistake. "Uncuff him," he ordered. The lawyer rubbed his wrists, sore and bruised. The younger officers avoided eye contact. "I'll need a report," the lawyer said firmly. His voice wasn't angry, but full of quiet power. "And I'll need your badge numbers." The supervisor nodded stiffly, muttering something about standard procedure. The lawyer didn't argue further. He just got back into his car and sat there for a while, staring at his reflection in the rear-view mirror. His lip was cut and his cheekbone was beginning to swell. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, They don't even know who they just did this to. When he reached home, he washed his face, cleaned his small wounds, and sat down in silence. The jazz playlist was still running softly in the background. The notes that once relaxed him now felt strange, almost haunting. He thought about the irony, spending years defending others from wrongful arrests, only to become a victim himself. He knew he had to decide, stay silent or fight back. The next morning, he went to the hospital for medical documentation. He didn't exaggerate or dramatize. He simply told the truth. I was detained during a traffic stop. I didn't resist, but I was handled aggressively. The nurse took notes carefully and handed him the report afterward. You should rest, she said kindly. He nodded, but didn't plan to rest. He went home, opened his laptop, and started writing down every detail. Time, location, words spoken, even the smell of the night air. He knew that memory could fade, but evidence could not. Later, he called a colleague, someone he trusted deeply. Something happened last night, he said. What do you mean? The colleague asked. I got pulled over. It turned violent. Are you okay? I will be, he said after a pause. But this time I'm not letting it go. Over the next few days, the story began to spread quietly. A neighbor had shared one of the videos online, showing part of the incident. People commented in shock and anger. The local news picked it up, reporting it as a possible case of police misconduct. The lawyer avoided public statements for now. He didn't want to be seen as emotional or reactive. He wanted to be strategic. He spent nights reviewing similar past cases, looking for patterns, studying the department's disciplinary records. Each time he saw his reflection in the mirror, he was reminded of that night not out of fear, but as fuel. He visited his parents that weekend. They were worried, of course. His mother said softly, "Why do you always have to fight everyone's battles, including your own?" He smiled faintly. "Because if I don't, someone else will have to." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he said. When he left their house, he sat in his car for a few minutes, thinking about all the clients he had defended, people who had been scared, powerless, and mistreated. He had always told them to believe in the system, that justice worked if handled the right way. Now, he needed to prove that himself. That night, he wrote his first formal complaint, carefully worded and supported by evidence. He attached the medical report, timestamps, and his own notes. It wasn't just paperwork. It was his voice, strong and unbroken. He looked at the document once more before pressing send. "This isn't revenge," he whispered. "This is about respect." The next morning, he received confirmation that the complaint had been received. An internal investigation was to begin. He knew it would be a long road, full of delays, excuses, and attempts to cover up. But he was ready. As he walked out of his office that day, sunlight hit his face, and for the first time since that night, he smiled. He knew this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was bigger. It was about what justice really means when those who are supposed to protect cross the line. And though he still felt the ache in his shoulder and the faint sting of humiliation, something deeper had awakened in him, a determination that could not be silenced. He looked up at the courthouse building across the street and thought, next time I step inside, it won't be as a defense lawyer. It'll be as a man demanding justice for himself. He turned and walked away slowly, knowing this was just the beginning of something far greater than one man's story, and it was the start of a fight that would test not only his strength but the very idea of fairness he had built his career on. The days after the incident felt heavy. Each morning, when the lawyer looked in the mirror, he saw the faint bruises still marking his face. His shoulder ached when he moved his arm, and sleeping through the night had become difficult. But what hurt more than the physical pain was the thought that this had happened to him, a man who had spent his life believing in the justice system. He tried to go back to work, pretending everything was normal. His colleagues greeted him as usual, but their eyes showed quiet concern. Everyone in the office had seen the video circulating online. They didn't want to make him uncomfortable, so most said nothing. But he could feel their questions hanging in the air. At lunch, one of his close coworkers finally spoke up. "Are you going to take action?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, but not in anger. I'll do it by the book. Just be careful," his colleague said softly. "You know how hard it can be when it's the police." "I know," he replied. "But that's exactly why it has to be done right." When he returned to his office, he sat for a long time staring at the photo on his desk, a picture of his graduation day. He remembered how proud he had been to walk across that stage to earn the title of attorney. He had promised himself that he would use the law to make a difference, to stand up for those who had no voice. Now he realized the fight had found its way to his own doorstep. Later that week, he received a letter confirming that an internal investigation had begun. He knew what that meant: long waits, endless paperwork, and an uphill battle against a system designed to protect itself. Still, he felt a strange calm. He had been in courtrooms hundreds of times. He understood how to gather facts, build arguments, and find truth among lies. But this time, the case was personal. He started by organizing every piece of evidence he had: photos, medical reports, timestamps, and written notes about what happened that night. He requested access to the body cam footage, though he suspected the department would delay it. He also began reaching out to journalists who had covered similar cases before, not to seek fame, but to make sure the story couldn't be buried. At night, when the city went quiet, he worked alone in his home office. The soft hum of his computer was the only sound in the room. He would replay the video clip, pausing and rewinding, studying every detail. He didn't watch it out of anger, but to remind himself why he had to keep going. Some nights his hands trembled slightly as he typed. He wasn't scared of the law. He was scared of being silenced. A few days later, his phone rang. It was his younger brother. "I saw the news," his brother said. "You sure you want to keep this going? They don't like when people push back." "I'm sure," the lawyer replied. "If I stop now, it tells them they can do this to anyone." His brother sighed. "I just don't want you to get hurt again." "I won't," he said, trying to sound confident. But deep down he knew this fight could get messy. Weeks passed and the bruises faded. But the case was just beginning to heat up. The department released a short statement claiming the officers had acted within procedure, even though the video clearly showed otherwise. The lawyer knew they were setting up their defense. He met with a small group of community advocates who wanted to support him. They offered to organize a press conference, but he declined for now. "Let the evidence speak first," he said. "I don't want emotions to cloud the truth." He was strategic. He understood how public pressure could help, but he also knew that timing mattered. Too early, and the story might fade before the real fight began. Too late, and the system might bury it. Every morning he went for a walk before work. The air helped him think. He often found himself replaying conversations with his clients. How many times he had told them to trust the process, to stay patient, to keep faith in the system. Now he had to live by his own words. One morning as he passed by a small park, an older man sitting on a bench called out to him. "You that lawyer from the news?" The lawyer stopped and nodded. The man smiled sadly. "I saw what happened. I'm glad you're standing up. Most people don't. They just take it and move on." "Some things are too important to walk away from," the lawyer replied. The old man nodded again. "Just make sure they don't wear you down. That's what they count on." Those words stayed with him. That's what they count on, people giving up. A month after the complaint, he finally received partial access to the body cam footage. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to show that he had been calm and compliant. He noticed how one officer had turned slightly away from the camera right before the rough handling began. That moment would matter later. He knew it. He saved multiple copies and stored them safely. A few nights later, as he reviewed the files again, he received an anonymous email. It was from someone claiming to work inside the department. The message was short: "Be careful. They're trying to make you look like you provoked them." He stared at the screen for a long time. He wasn't surprised, but the warning made the air feel colder. Still, he refused to stop. He started preparing a civil rights lawsuit, carefully outlining the legal arguments and citing previous cases where officers had faced consequences for similar behavior. He wasn't seeking money. He wanted accountability. He wanted a record, something that would live in public files, reminding others that silence was not the answer. During this time, he faced whispers from colleagues who thought he should drop it. Some were afraid that taking on the police might hurt his career, or make judges view him differently in other cases. But he didn't care. He remembered what one of his law professors once told him. Real justice isn't about comfort. It's about courage when it's inconvenient. He wrote that line on a sticky note and placed it on his desk. It became his quiet motivation. As weeks turned into months, the investigation dragged on. He would get letters filled with vague updates, phrases like under review and pending further examination. He knew they were buying time, hoping he would lose interest. But he didn't. Each delay only made him more determined. One evening, while organizing his papers, he found a small notepad he had kept years ago when he was still a law student. Inside were scribbled quotes and goals, things he wanted to achieve someday. One line caught his eye. Use the law not just to win, but to heal. He sat back in his chair, staring at those words. Maybe that's what this case was about. Healing, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet. Around this time, a local reporter reached out again, asking for an interview. He agreed. Sitting in the studio under bright lights, he spoke clearly and calmly. "This isn't about anger," he said. "It's about accountability. The law is supposed to protect all of us equally. When it doesn't, we must make it right." The interview aired that night, and it spread quickly online. People from across the country began sending messages of support. Some shared their own stories of being mistreated. Others thanked him for standing up. He didn't reply to most messages, there were too many, but he read each one. Every word reminded him that this fight was no longer just personal. Back at home, he continued his daily routine: work, paperwork, long nights of research. He met with a few trusted allies quietly, people who understood how to navigate legal pressure. Together they built a strong case piece by piece. Sometimes he still felt the weight of fear, the what-ifs that came late at night when everything was still. What if they retaliated? What if the court dismissed it? What if nothing changed? But each time doubt crept in, he would replay that night in his mind. The lights, the cold ground, the way no one listened when he said, "I'm a lawyer." That memory was enough to keep him going. As spring arrived, the internal report finally reached his hands. Reading through it, he felt both anger and relief. It was full of excuses, half-truths, and contradictions. But it also confirmed small pieces that would help his case, details they couldn't hide. He smiled faintly. "That's all I need," he whispered. He took a deep breath, looked out the window at the fading sunset, and said quietly to himself, "You wanted to break me, but all you did was wake me up." The road ahead was still long, but he was no longer just a victim. He was a man preparing for battle, armed with truth, patience, and a faith that justice, though slow, still had a heartbeat. And this time he wasn't just defending someone else's story. He was defending his own. The day the lawyer filed his case, the city courthouse was buzzing. People whispered in hallways, and reporters waited near the steps hoping to catch a glimpse of him. He walked through the front doors wearing his usual calm expression, carrying a slim folder in one hand. He had been here hundreds of times before, but today was different. Today he wasn't representing someone else, he was standing up for himself. He knew how difficult this battle would be. Taking on a police department wasn't like any other case. The system was built to protect itself. But that didn't stop him. The pain of that night, the humiliation, the lies, it all pushed him forward. He had spent months gathering evidence, organizing witnesses, and preparing his arguments carefully. This wasn't revenge. It was justice. When he entered the courtroom, he took a deep breath. The walls felt heavier than usual, but he stood tall. The opposing lawyers sat across the room, representing the officers and the department. They looked confident, almost relaxed, like they had seen this play out before. But he had a quiet strength in his eyes, the kind that comes from truth. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The hearing began. The first few minutes were all legal formalities, introductions, statements, and objections. But the moment he began to speak, the room changed. His voice was steady, clear, and full of emotion. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not just about one night. It's about the power of the law and whether it applies equally to everyone. What happened to me was not an accident. It was a failure of responsibility." He laid out the events step by step, describing how he was stopped, how he complied, and how things escalated without cause. He didn't dramatize it. He just told the truth, the way it had happened. Every sentence felt like a weight being lifted from his chest. Across the room, the officers avoided eye contact. Their attorney interrupted often, trying to paint him as emotional and biased. But he stayed calm. Years of courtroom experience had taught him how to turn interruptions into opportunities. "Counsel," he said politely at one point, "I understand you're doing your job, but what we're discussing here isn't opinion, it's evidence." The judge nodded for him to continue. He played the body cam footage for the court. The lights dimmed slightly and the screen came to life. The sound of that night filled the room. The flashing lights, the tension in the officers' voices, and his calm tone trying to explain who he was. Then came the moment when one officer grabbed him and the courtroom went silent. It was difficult to watch even for him, but he didn't look away. When the video ended, the silence stretched for a long few seconds. The judge finally spoke. "We'll take a short recess." During the break, people whispered among themselves. Some were visibly shaken. The lawyer sat quietly at his table, taking slow breaths. He didn't smile or look for validation. He knew the journey was far from over. The system would still resist, and he needed to be patient. When the session resumed, the defense began their argument. They claimed he had been uncooperative and verbally aggressive. They brought out police reports that didn't match the footage, hoping confusion would protect them. He let them talk. When it was his turn to cross-examine, his tone was calm but precise. "Officer," he said, looking directly at one of them, "in your report you mentioned that I resisted. Can you point to the exact moment in this video where that happens?" The officer hesitated. "It's not visible in the video, so it doesn't exist?" the lawyer asked, his voice quiet but sharp. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I felt threatened." "You felt threatened by a man standing still with his hands on the car identifying himself as a lawyer?" No answer. The courtroom was still. Even the defense attorney seemed unsure of what to say next. He continued, "I've defended many clients accused of resisting arrest. The word felt often replaces proof, but this court requires evidence, not emotion. Isn't that right?" The judge nodded slightly. The officer remained silent. That small exchange changed everything. The case began to turn. The truth was finally finding space to breathe. In the following days, more witnesses were called. One of them was a retired teacher who lived near the intersection where the incident happened. She testified that she had seen the whole thing from her window. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said. "He was calm the whole time. I remember because I was scared for him." The courtroom grew quiet again. Her words carried weight, not just because she was a witness, but because she spoke from the heart. When the session ended that day, the lawyer walked outside to find a small crowd gathered. Some were reporters, others just ordinary people who had followed the case. They clapped softly as he passed by, but he didn't bask in it. He simply nodded and said, "This isn't over yet." That night back home, he sat by the window with a cup of tea. The city lights blinked in the distance. He thought about everything that had led to this moment, the fear, the pain, the anger, and how easily it could have broken him. But it hadn't. If anything, it had made him stronger. He remembered what the old man in the park had said. "Don't let them wear you down." He smiled faintly. "Not a chance," he whispered. The next hearing was even tougher. The defense tried to discredit him by suggesting he was using the case for publicity. They presented articles, social media posts, and online comments twisting his motives. He didn't flinch. "If the truth being public is uncomfortable," he said to the court, "that discomfort doesn't make it false." He knew that being both the lawyer and the victim made some people uneasy. But he also knew that no one could tell his story better than he could. As the weeks passed, the trial became a national topic. News channels debated the case, some supporting him, others questioning whether he was making it about race. He didn't engage in those arguments. His focus remained on the facts. One evening, after a long day in court, he received a message from a young law student. It said, "I saw your case. I want to be a lawyer like you, someone who doesn't back down." He smiled when he read it. For the first time in a while, he felt hope. Maybe what he was doing was inspiring more people than he realized. In the next session, he presented the timeline of events with precision. Every second of that night was documented. When he was pulled over, when he spoke, when the officers made contact. His presentation was calm, logical, and thorough. When he finished, the judge looked thoughtful. The defense seemed tense. It was clear that the evidence had created doubt about the officer's story. But the lawyer knew that the system didn't change easily. Winning this case wouldn't just be about the truth, it would be about persistence. As he left the courthouse that day, he saw children walking home from school. They laughed and ran along the sidewalk carefree. He stopped for a moment and thought about how many parents feared their children growing up in a world where fairness depended on luck instead of law. That thought strengthened his resolve even more. That night, he met with a few community leaders who had been following his case. They thanked him for giving people hope. "You're showing that the law can work," one of them said. "I'm showing that it should work," he replied. "It's supposed to protect, not divide." The next morning, he prepared for the final round of hearings. He knew that this was where everything would come together: the truth, the courage, and the years he had spent believing in justice. He stood before the court, looked around the room, and spoke softly but firmly. "I didn't come here for revenge," he said. "I came here because I believe in the law. I've spent my career defending it. And when it failed me, I didn't walk away. I stood up for it. Because justice isn't just a word, it's a promise. And a promise means nothing if it only protects some of us." His closing words left the courtroom in silence. Even those who had doubted him seemed moved. When the judge called for adjournment, he gathered his files slowly. Outside, the crowd was larger now. Reporters, supporters, and curious onlookers. Microphones reached toward him, cameras flashed, questions filled the air. He raised his hand gently. "This case isn't about hate," he said. "It's about hope, and I believe the truth has already spoken for itself." He walked away from the noise, heading toward his car. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The fight wasn't over, but he had done what he came to do: stand his ground with dignity and strength. As he drove home, the city lights flickered past his window. He smiled to himself. "Let the truth do its work now," he whispered. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that the wheels of justice were finally beginning to turn. The courthouse looked different that morning. The air outside was filled with voices, cameras, and people holding signs asking for fairness. It wasn't a protest filled with anger. It was a quiet call for change. Journalists stood near the steps, waiting to catch a glimpse of the man who had turned a painful moment into a legal storm that now shook the city. When he stepped out of the black car, people clapped. Some cheered his name. Others just nodded as if they were saying, "Keep going. We're with you." He didn't wave or smile too much. He just took a breath, adjusted his tie, and walked up the stairs. Inside, his heart was steady, even if everything around him was chaos. That day wasn't just another hearing. It was the day when both sides would be fully heard. The officers had their lawyers, each trying to paint a story that made sense for them. They said they acted out of confusion, that they thought he was a threat, that things happened too fast. The same excuses the public had heard many times before. But now, the man sitting across from them was no ordinary citizen. He was a lawyer who knew the system inside out, and he had nothing left to lose. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks, and people who had followed the story online watched from the back. There was a kind of quiet tension, the kind that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. The judge entered, and everyone stood. The trial resumed. When it was his turn to speak, he stood calmly, holding a few sheets of paper. His voice was steady but carried weight. "Your Honor," he began, "I was told once that the courtroom is the one place where truth still has a chance. I hope that's still true today." He walked a few steps toward the jury box. "This is not just about what happened to me. It's about what happens when power goes unchecked. It's about how a lie can become truth if no one stands up to challenge it." He paused and then pointed toward the screen behind him. The body cam footage began to play. The room went silent again. Everyone watched as the images told the story better than any words could. They saw the calm man being questioned, then suddenly pushed down, his voice pleading for them to check his ID. No yelling, no threat, just confusion and pain. The video ended, leaving a thick silence. The lawyer turned to face the officer's side. "I don't hate any of you," he said, "but I will not let this pass as if it's normal." Because it isn't. One of the officers looked down. Another stared at the floor. The defense tried to regain control, objecting and calling the footage misleading, but the judge allowed it to stay. It was a key moment, one that turned the case from technical arguments into something deeply human. Outside the courtroom, people started gathering in larger numbers. News channels began airing updates every few hours. Interviews with community members, legal experts, and even other lawyers filled the airwaves. Some said it was the beginning of a bigger movement. Others warned that the system rarely punished its own. Back inside, the case continued with witnesses. The retired teacher who had seen the event from her window took the stand. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear. "I saw everything," she said. "He didn't do anything wrong. He just stood there asking what was happening. Then they threw him down. It wasn't right." Her words carried honesty, the kind that didn't need fancy language. When she finished, the lawyer nodded at her softly, grateful. Her statement became another piece of truth the defense couldn't twist. Day after day, the trial went on. The lawyer stayed composed even when the defense tried to rattle him. They brought up his past cases, questioned his motives, even hinted that he was doing this for fame. But each time he responded with patience. "If fame was my goal," he said once, "I would have stayed quiet. Silence gets more peace. But silence also lets wrongs go unchallenged." The crowd in the courtroom listened closely. Some wiped their eyes. Others leaned forward as if his courage gave them strength. Every word he spoke wasn't just about the law. It was about dignity, about standing tall even when the world tries to break you. As the trial neared its end, the city began to change. People who never cared about such cases before were now talking about fairness and reform. A few police officers, quietly and anonymously, reached out to support his cause. They said not every badge stood for what happened that night, and they wanted to help make things right. One morning, as he entered the courthouse again, a young man stopped him outside. "My brother went through something like what you did," he said softly. "We couldn't fight it back then, but watching you, it feels like maybe we can now." The lawyer didn't have words at first. He simply placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "That's why we fight." That day inside court, the defense made their final argument, saying the incident was an unfortunate misunderstanding. They spoke of stress, training, and confusion. But as they talked, people's faces in the courtroom showed disbelief. They'd seen the footage, heard the witnesses, and felt the truth. When it was the lawyer's turn to close, he didn't speak like someone seeking revenge. He spoke like someone seeking balance. "I don't want them destroyed," he said quietly. "I want the truth to mean something again. Because if the law doesn't protect those who follow it, then it protects no one at all." His words echoed. Even the judge seemed moved. When he finished, the courtroom sat in silence before the judge called for a short recess. Outside, the air buzzed with emotion. People started chanting softly for justice. But it wasn't loud or angry. It was hopeful. Later that evening, as he sat in his apartment surrounded by files and letters of support from strangers, he finally allowed himself to breathe. For the first time in months, he felt a small sense of peace. Not because the battle was over, but because he had done what was right. He looked at one of the letters that simply read, "Thank you for standing up." That sentence stayed in his mind long after he turned off the light. In the following days, documentaries and articles began to appear. People called him brave, though he didn't see it that way. He saw himself as someone who just refused to let fear decide the outcome. His story became a conversation starter in schools and legal forums. Even children began to learn about standing up peacefully through him. Still, he knew the fight wasn't finished. The verdict was yet to come, and anything could happen. But deep down, he understood something powerful. Truth, once spoken clearly, has a life of its own. It can't be hidden forever. That thought gave him strength. He went to bed that night not as a victim or even a lawyer fighting his own case, but as a man who had turned pain into purpose. The next morning, the courthouse was even more crowded. People held signs that read, "Justice matters and truth is strength." The lawyer walked past them quietly, nodding. He could feel the weight of their hope. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been told to stay silent. And as he walked through the tall wooden doors again, he knew something had changed. The courtroom wasn't just a place of judgment now. It had become a place of reckoning. The morning of the verdict felt heavier than usual. The sky was gray, and the courthouse steps were already crowded with people, reporters, and flashing cameras. Some held coffee cups, others held small signs with words like "Truth wins" and "Justice for all." The air was filled with quiet tension, the kind that makes every sound seem louder. Inside, the lawyer sat in silence, his fingers resting on the table. The courtroom was full again. Every seat taken, every eye fixed on the front. The officer sat across from him looking stiff and uneasy. The judge hadn't arrived yet, but everyone knew this was the day that would decide how this long, painful battle would end. He looked down at the stack of papers in front of him. Notes, evidence, letters of support from strangers he'd never met. He didn't need to read them. He just kept them close, a reminder of why he fought so hard. When the judge finally entered, the room rose. The sound of the gavel echoed, and the judge spoke in a calm but serious voice. After careful review of all the evidence, testimonies, and submitted materials, this court has reached a verdict. Every breath in the room seemed to stop. The judge continued reading, going through each charge slowly. As the words filled the air, it became clear. The officers were found guilty of misconduct and of filing false reports. The courtroom remained silent for a moment, as if people needed time to believe what they just heard. Then a quiet wave of emotion spread. A few people clapped softly, others whispered, some even cried. The lawyer sat still, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He didn't smile or cheer. He simply took a slow breath and let the relief sink in. It wasn't joy, it was peace. The judge ordered the department to issue a public apology and awarded damages to the lawyer for the harm he suffered. But for him, that wasn't the part that mattered most. What mattered was that the truth had finally been spoken in a place where it was once hidden. When the judge left, the courtroom turned into a sea of movement. Reporters rushing to send out headlines, people reaching out to shake his hand, and cameras flashing nonstop. He answered a few questions politely but didn't stay long. He wasn't looking for fame. He just wanted air. Outside, the crowd cheered as he stepped down the courthouse stairs. He looked at them, then at the reporters' microphones, all pointing toward his face. After a pause, he spoke clearly and calmly. "This isn't victory," he said. "This is accountability. Real victory will be when no one has to fight like this again." The words echoed beyond the crowd, spreading online within minutes. News stations replayed the clip again and again. It became a message that reached far beyond that city. That night, when he returned home, the apartment was quiet. He placed his suit jacket on the chair and stood by the window. The city lights blinked in the distance. For months, his life had been noise. Arguments, interviews, papers, hearings. But now there was only silence, and it felt almost strange. He sat down and opened one of the letters from his desk. It was from an older man, a retired officer who had followed the case. The letter said, "You reminded me what the badge was supposed to mean. Thank you for fighting even when it wasn't easy." He read the letter twice, then placed it carefully back on the desk. It wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about sparking something bigger, something that could make others think, speak, and change. Over the next few weeks, the story spread across the country. People in other towns started holding discussions about fairness and equality. Law schools invited him to speak to students about ethics, courage, and reform. He always began those talks with the same line: "The law is only powerful when we make it human." At first, he wasn't sure if anyone truly listened. But one day, a young woman came up to him after a speech. She said, "I watched your case. It made me want to become a lawyer. Not for the money or the title, but to stand up for people who can't." He smiled softly and said, "Then it was worth it." Months passed, and his life slowly returned to something like normal. But it wasn't the same kind of normal. People recognized him now, and his name had become a symbol of persistence and hope. He didn't let it change him. He still spent his mornings reading, his afternoons helping clients, and his evenings thinking about how to improve the system from the inside. One afternoon, he visited a small community center where families gathered to talk about legal rights and community safety. He had helped start the program, using part of his settlement money. Watching people discuss their concerns openly gave him quiet satisfaction. This was what he wanted, a space where people didn't feel powerless. After one session, an older woman approached him. Her eyes were kind but tired. She said softly, "You gave us courage. For years we thought nothing would ever change, but you proved that one person can make a difference if they don't give up." He nodded, humbled, and replied, "Change starts small, but it grows when people believe in it." The woman smiled, and that moment stayed with him.